Hey guys, tonight we're going deep into the glittering, dusty, paranoid world of ancient Egyptian royalty. Because it turns out, having everything isn't all that fun when everyone wants to take it from you. Picture this. The air is thick with the scent of myrrh. Your arms are stacked with gold bangles so heavy your elbows are aching, and a servant is fanning your forehead while another one peels your grapes. But there's something off. A glance from a scribe lingers too long. A cousin bows a little too shallow. A priest chants something in your honor. But are those sarcasm vibes? You're the Pharaoh, the chosen one, the living god, and you're sleeping with a dagger under your pillow because someone in your palace wants that title just a little more than you do. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and tell me in the comments where are you tuning in from, and what time is it where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Gold in ancient Egypt wasn't just wealth, it was sacred. The flesh of the gods was said to be made of gold, which meant royalty walked around encased in the divine. Everything that touched the pharaoh glistened: chairs, sandals, combs, even toenail cleaners. Yes, they had gold-plated grooming kits. If something could be encrusted, embossed, or bedazzled, it was even the mosquito traps looked fancy. To outsiders, and even many of their own citizens, Egyptian royalty looked untouchable. But underneath that glowing surface was a constant low-level panic, like the hum of locusts in the distance. That wealth didn't come with comfort, it came with expectations, spiritual obligations, and just the occasional assassination attempt. Because gold wasn't just pretty, it was dangerous. Imagine waking up in your gilded bed with walls inlaid with lapis lazuli, only to be greeted by a trembling servant who's just discovered that 3 statues from the temple treasury are missing, stolen, maybe melted down, maybe part of some black market charm necklace sold to a foreign envoy. And guess who gets blamed? You. Even if it wasn't your fault. Especially if it wasn't your fault. Because in a system where the king is literally a god, then anything bad that happens is automatically your divine failure, and you couldn't just brush it off. Nope, you had to respond with massive displays of atonement, offerings, rituals, and sometimes terrifying public punishments, all to show that you were in control, still holy, still worthy of the god's favor, even if you hadn't slept in days, because your royal goldsmith might be part of a smuggling ring run by your niece's tutor. One mainstream historical fact here: during the New Kingdom, Egypt became so rich in gold that it dominated the international economy. Other kingdoms begged for gold in their letters, calling Egypt the Gold Land. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III sent it by the ton to their allies and frenemies alike. Imagine Amazon Prime but with solid gold statues of lions instead of toasters. But the sheer flood of wealth led to problems: hoarding, theft, counterfeiting. People tried mixing gold with copper to fake tributes. And even priests. Yes, the guys who were supposed to be your spiritual backup sometimes helped themselves to temple offerings. Historians still argue whether this temple looting was organized corruption or desperate survival, especially during years when the Nile didn't flood right and the grain shipments dried up. And yet the public rituals continued. You paraded through Thebes, gold collar choking your neck, heat bouncing off your shaven scalp. You smiled, of course, waved, pretended your eyebrows weren't melting. But you knew somewhere in that crowd was a spy, a thief, maybe even a killer. Every gleaming ornament on your robes was a target. So were you. There's a quirky little tidbit from one tomb: a golden finger protector, literally a golden sleeve, to protect your pinky during the embalming process. So not only were your living hands wrapped in wealth, you had to make sure your corpse didn't get less attention. Because even in death, royal bodies were golden goods to be stolen, traded, and displayed. But let's not skip ahead to death just yet. You're still alive, still wearing that massive pectoral charm shaped like a scarab, still surrounded by gold leaf everything. But there's a sense of hollowness. You're not really wearing the gold is wearing you. It dictates your movements, your alliances, even your dreams. Dreams you don't share with anyone, because what if the high priest interprets them wrong? What if your fear becomes prophecy? You can't take a pilgrimage in peace because your caravan becomes a mobile bank vault. You can't fall asleep easily because your pillows are silk stuffed, but your head is full of names. Scribes, stewards, concubines, any of whom might decide your godhood is no longer convenient. And the worst part, you can't even vent. You're a god. Gods don't complain. They inspire. They manifest abundance. They absolutely do not whine about foot cramps or temple audits. So yes, being royalty in ancient Egypt meant walking through life dipped in sunlight, bathed in incense, and surrounded by jewels. But it also meant being stalked by the weight of your own image, never cracking, never faltering, never losing face. One slip, and your statues got quietly recarved into someone else's face. So maybe don't envy the Pharaoh just yet. You'll see. So, your palace shimmers in the desert sun. There are lotus blossoms floating in polished granite basins, ivory-handled fans wafting away the heat, and attendants slipping around like shadows to fill your goblet before you even lift it. But something else is floating in the air too. Tension, the kind that makes you keep a dagger under your pillow, even though your sheets are embroidered with gold thread. Because you don't just have enemies out in the deserts or beyond the Nile, they're closer, much closer, possibly eating lunch across from you at the royal table. See, in ancient Egypt, being royal was like being trapped in an endless episode of palace-themed reality TV, with higher stakes and far more eyeliner. And the most dangerous players? Your own family. There's no sugarcoating it. Pharaohs had a very rough time keeping their bloodline, both pure and alive. Succession didn't work like a neat little handoff. It was a backstabbing, rumor-fueled chess match, where everyone had a claim and no one played fair. Your sister may be eyeing the throne, your brother might be accidentally preparing poisonous figs. Even your stepmother might be aligning with foreign powers for a friendly little coup. Take the case of Hatshepsut, for example. She wasn't just a queen consort, she became pharaoh, possibly nudging her way in while the official heir, her stepson Thutmose III, was still a kid. Some historians argue she ruled peacefully, others suspect she clawed her way to power with serious strategy. Either way, once Thutmose III grew up and got back in charge, someone had her statues smashed and her name chiseled out of monuments. Can't imagine that was a family group hug moment. And what about Akhenaten's weird dynasty? His son Tutankhamun, yes, the famous golden boy, likely died young in part due to the genetic consequences of all that royal inbreeding. He married his half-sister. Their stillborn daughters were mummified and buried with them. The royal crib was a dangerous place before you could even walk. Quirky tidbit: there's speculation that King Ramses III, the Mighty One, was murdered in a palace conspiracy orchestrated by one of his own wives and a whole band of officials. The evidence? A papyrus trial transcript that reads like a crime thriller, complete with magic spells, hired assassins, and sudden disappearances. One guy was sentenced to death, another forced to take his own life, which sounds suspiciously like ancient PR, for we had him quietly removed. It wasn't just jealousy or greed though, let's be real, there was a lot of that. It was also about survival. If you were the child of a pharaoh, but not the chosen heir, your options weren't great. Be a priest, be married off for diplomacy, or try to change the line of succession. The longer a king lived, the more crowded the palace got with minor royals, and each one was a potential threat or a potential ally in your next scheme. And remember, the crown didn't come with retirement plans. If you wanted to quit, tough luck. Pharaoh wasn't a job, it was your identity, your divine role. Abdication wasn't a thing. You either died naturally, rare, or you died suddenly in a suspicious bathhouse incident. Historians still argue whether royal murders were rare, or if they were just very good at covering them up. The lack of direct evidence might mean stability, or that the ancient PR teams were absolutely top tier at burying scandal, literally and figuratively. Meanwhile, every day in the palace was like living inside a rumor mill, with better architecture. Servants whispered. Scribes watched. Priests played politics disguised as prophecy. And you? You had to smile through it all. Smile while eating dinner with someone who might have bribed your cupbearer. Smile while your own child talked just a little too much about the will of the gods. changing suddenly, and the official ceremonies didn't help. Your coronation, not just a party, it was a ritual theater where your legitimacy got paraded like a sacred cow, complete with chants, sacrifices, and long, symbolic robes you couldn't walk in without help, all while your rivals watched and planned. Even dreams were risky. If you had a nightmare, you couldn't just brush it off. The priests would be summoned, the stars reread, the omens recorded. Dreams were political currency. If someone heard you dreamed of falling, suddenly there'd be whispers that the gods were angry, or worse, that you'd lost their favor and needed replacing. You couldn't even trust statues. They weren't just art. They held spiritual power. Royal families often erased the names and faces of their rivals from statues to strip them of divine legitimacy in the afterlife. Imagine your siblings scratching your name off your yearbook photo and claiming your spot in the family crypt, but with magic. And of course, you didn't get to pick your family. Dynasties had rules. Bloodlines had expectations, so marriages often stayed uncomfortably close, like second cousin or closer close. It was meant to keep the divine blood pure, but it also turned the palace into a slow genetic time bomb. That crown on your head? It didn't just glitter, it painted a target. Every time you smiled for a ritual or blessed the crops, someone was watching your back just a little too closely. Maybe with a dagger, maybe with a curse scroll, maybe with both. So next time you imagine ancient royalty as serene, pampered, golden demigods, remember this: half their job was just staying alive inside their own homes. And when the people most likely to kill you also shared your last name, it made Sunday dinners feel a little tense. You couldn't sneeze without a priest wondering if it was a sign from Ra. That's how bad it was. Being Pharaoh wasn't just a job. It wasn't even just a lifestyle. It was a cosmic role you didn't ask for, one you were usually born into, like being the lead actor in a play that never ends and has real consequences if you flub your lines. You weren't simply king, you were divine. You were Horus while alive, Osiris when dead, and expected to carry out the divine order of the universe, known as Ma, all while managing floods, famines, diplomacy, taxes, the occasional coup, and possibly a fungal rash under your headdress. And you had to look perfect doing it. Every single day. The moment you stepped outside your quarters, you weren't a person anymore. You were a living god, and you'd better carry yourself like one. Even if your back hurt from last night's 3-hour temple ceremony where you stood motionless under 40 pounds of gold and goose feathers. Because that was part of the divine brand. And that brand came with no room for error. The high priests read the stars and guts of birds for portents. But your own body was a prophecy, limp slightly, and people assumed a curse was taking root. Speak in a hoarse voice, and suddenly there's panic that the gods are withdrawing their favor. One story from the later dynasties even hints at a pharaoh retreating from public view for months, possibly from illness, only to reappear with carefully staged rituals meant to restore his divine shine. Historians still argue whether he was just sick or had lost political favor and needed to reboot his image. Your word wasn't just law, it was cosmic law. And if you didn't maintain that image of power and perfection, the balance of the entire universe could collapse. Or at least that's what the priests told everyone. And they were very convincing. It's a lot to ask of someone who probably hadn't slept more than 4 hours in weeks. That divine burden didn't stop at public appearances. It seeped into your dreams, your food, even your bathroom habits. Yes, there were records of rituals related to royal hygiene. Even bodily functions had to follow protocol. You think your job micromanages you? Try peeing according to spiritual calendars. Quirky tidbit: one pharaoh reportedly refused to eat fish because it was considered impure for someone of divine status. Not because he didn't like the taste, but because eating like a regular person would undermine the whole God in human form deal. Some scholars think he secretly liked it, and just had to pretend otherwise to keep up appearances. You didn't get sick, you didn't feel tired, you didn't age. And if you did any of those things, someone got sacrificed to fix it. But behind the smoke and mirrors, well, mostly frankincense and myrrh, to be precise, you were human. With all the weaknesses, cravings, and fears that come with it. Imagine feeling chest pain and wondering if it's your diet or divine punishment, or having a nightmare and being forced to share it with a priest, who then tells you the gods are angry because you skipped the morning hymn. There were even ceremonies where the pharaoh had to ritually recharge divine power, because if you didn't, people thought your connection to the gods was fading. This wasn't a one-and-done coronation thing, it was recurring, like renewing your license but with incense, chants, and occasionally a fake battle to symbolically defeat chaos. You were also expected to know things you couldn't possibly know. Ancient Egypt had a dazzlingly complex religious system, with dozens of gods, each with different moods, temples, and preferred offerings. You didn't just worship them, you were them, or their child, or their divine reflection, depending on which scroll you were reading that week. Slip up on a ritual? It could bring drought, pestilence, rebellion. Or at least that's what your enemies would say. Oh, the crops failed. Clearly, the pharaoh forgot to bless the floodwaters correctly, and suddenly your divine credentials were under review. Maybe by the priests, maybe by your own nephew who's been eyeing the throne. Mainstream historical fact. During the said festival, which happened every 30 years or whenever the pharaoh felt like a PR boost, the king had to ritually prove his vitality by running laps and reenacting battles. Yes, even in old age. So imagine Grandpa Pharaoh being wheeled out to jog a few symbolic meters so people wouldn't start whispering about replacing him. Totally normal day. This divine burden also meant isolation. You couldn't chat casually. Every word was measured, every gesture symbolic. If you cried in public, it might be interpreted as a sign the gods were mourning, or worse, predicting doom. You might have had hundreds of servants, scribes, concubines, advisors, and guards. But genuine friends, probably not. Because no one relaxes around a living god. And living gods don't get to have bad days. Even your love life was bound by theology. Marriage wasn't about feelings. It was about maintaining divine bloodlines, balancing cosmic energies, and sometimes keeping the throne away from that one ambitious cousin. If you did fall for someone, it better be discreet, or divine, or ideally both. And all of this, every chant, every ritual, every exhausting symbolism-crammed ceremony, was broadcast, not with cameras but with stone. Scribes carved your deeds into temple walls, statues, stelae and obelisks, so no one could forget how utterly flawless you were. Which was great, unless you made a mistake. Then they'd just chisel your name out of everything, like you never existed. So yeah, being pharaoh meant eternal fame, but it also meant the pressure to be flawless while human, immortal while mortal, and worshipped by people who might secretly want you gone. Every day was a performance, and the stage never went dark. And the worst part? You weren't allowed to break character. You wake up before dawn, and you're not alone. You're never alone. In fact, even in sleep, you're surrounded servants at the ready, priests muttering invocations from the hallway, scribes standing by with their little reed pens just waiting to record the first words out of your mouth. The God King must never mumble. From the second your eyelids flutter open, you're on. There's no warm-up, no quiet coffee moment. You exist in a constant spotlight, and that spotlight is held up by centuries of tradition, expectation, and the rather enthusiastic attention of about 1,000 staff members whose entire careers depend on your flawless performance. Welcome to royal life in ancient Egypt, a non-stop, highly choreographed dance of visibility. You eat. There's a scribe noting the ingredients, not because he's meal planning, but because he needs to record that the divine body was nourished with appropriate, symbolically meaningful sustenance. If you dare to cough mid-meal, the priest nearby will likely start drawing comparisons to ancient omens, and maybe initiate a ritual just in case your lung spasm is an early sign of cosmic disharmony. You get dressed? That's a whole ritual too. You don't just throw on your clothes. No, you are clothed. By others. In garments that symbolize cosmic balance, political order, and religious devotion. If the hem of your tunic is an inch too long, someone's career, and maybe someone's liver is at risk. And if you think there's a place in the palace to just chill, think again. Your chamber, lined with sacred paintings and protective spells. Your garden stroll, observed by gardeners, guards, and sometimes a secret delegation of visiting dignitaries, who just happen to be watching how the divine body moves through sacred space. Not creepy at all. And when you finally get to sit down to do anything, someone is already writing it down. Literally everything you do is considered important enough to be recorded. Stretch your neck, a hieroglyph might appear somewhere in a temple wall, attributing it to a moment of divine rejuvenation. Sneeze, a scroll of blessings will probably be commissioned. There's no off the record, you are the record. Mainstream historical fact. Temple complexes like Karnak and Luxor weren't just places of worship. They were also administrative hubs, where royal deeds were recorded and displayed. Pharaohs had their military victories, festivals, offerings and rituals carved into stone to last forever. Even minor acts were sometimes elevated to god-tier stories. That time you donated a bunch of grain to a temple during a bad harvest. Boom, immortalized in granite with dramatic flair. But of course the danger in having everything recorded is, well, it's everything being recorded. You had a bad day? It's on the wall. Lost a battle? That's tricky. Now your scribes have to spin it into a strategic repositioning by divine will. Made a poor political choice? Expect a whole poetic hymn about how mysterious are the ways of the gods. Quirky tidbit. Pharaoh Setivant once recorded an offering list so detailed it included specific quantities of goose fat. Like, imagine being remembered for your poultry grease donations. Priorities. Historians still argue whether this obsessive documentation was purely ceremonial or also a form of political control. Because if everyone believed the pharaoh was flawless and guided by divine order, then questioning him wasn't just rebellion, it was sacrilege. But what if the image cracked? That's the terror that kept you up at night. Not death, not even war. It was the fear of being seen in the wrong light. Literally and figuratively. A poorly executed ritual that could spread panic. A whispered rumor about illness. Your enemies might use it to challenge your godhood. If enough people stopped believing, your entire reign could unravel. So even in moments of stillness, your expression had to be kingly. There's no slouching, no grimacing, just that iconic pharaonic stare, calm, confident, vaguely constipated. And yes, the makeup helped. Not just for looks, but as armor. That eyeliner, called kohl. It wasn't just fashionable, it had antibacterial properties and warded off the evil eye. Your face was a literal battleground of spiritual defense mechanisms. Crocodile dung sunscreen, possibly donkey milk baths. Likely. All of it part of the daily production known as maintaining the divine appearance. You're hungry, you're thirsty, and someone is literally watching to see if you blink too often. Even how you sat mattered. Slouch too much, and someone writes a treatise on how the Nile failed to rise, because your posture offended Happy, the river god. One wrong look, and boom, cosmic disharmony, blamed on your breakfast face. And let's not forget the sheer boredom. You're sitting through 6-hour rituals in a 100-degree courtyard, wearing 3 layers of linen and enough gold jewelry to weigh down a small chariot. Meanwhile, a line of temple dancers is slowly twirling while priests chant in ancient, sacred, utterly monotonous verse. Because gods shouldn't blink, there were no casual strolls through the market, no spontaneous trips to the river, no solo walks in the garden. If you so much as peeked through a window, someone would interpret it as a blessing on the street below, and next thing you know, there's a feast in your honor for doing absolutely nothing. The only people who lived more carefully than you were your heirs. They were trained from infancy to walk, speak, eat and breathe like future gods. Not a lot of playtime when your finger painting gets analyzed for prophetic signs. And the crowd, they never stop clapping. So what does it mean when every second of your life is a public performance? It means your real self, the tired, overwhelmed, possibly lactose-intolerant human, gets buried under layers of expectation, fear, and powdered gold. And it means the palace, for all its beauty, starts to feel like a cage made of applause. It hasn't even been built yet, but you're already thinking about it, planning it, funding it, worrying about it. Because in ancient Egypt, the afterlife wasn't some vague, glowing cloud of peace. It was a full-blown logistical nightmare. And if you were royalty, it was your personal responsibility to make sure your soul had a house, a map, a passport, a boat, and at least 12 protective amulets, preferably gold-plated. The desert nights are quiet, but your tomb isn't. You've been alive barely 3 decades. But your architects have been working on your burial complex since the day you put on the crown, that grand tomb in the Valley of the Kings. It's not just a place to rest. It's a fortress, a museum, a safe deposit box, and an interdimensional portal all in one, and it's taking up a shocking amount of your royal budget. Grave robbing wasn't a fringe problem, it was an industry. Guards were bribed, blueprints were leaked, sacred seals were broken, gold finger caps, jewel-encrusted sandals, even tiny statues meant to serve you in the afterlife, all looted, melted down, or sold to black market collectors before your mummy had even settled into its final pose. Every pharaoh knew your eternity was only as secure as your tomb's security system. And unfortunately, dead pharaohs made extremely attractive targets. You know that iconic golden mask of Tutankhamun, found intact? Yes, but he's the rare exception. Most royal tombs were stripped bare long before modern archaeologists showed up. Even Ramses II, the Great One, had to be reburied in a secret location centuries after his death, because his original tomb got ransacked like it was Black Friday at a divine electronics store. One mainstream historical fact: by the end of the New Kingdom, temple priests were actively relocating mummies to secret mass caches in the cliffs to protect them from thieves. Literal mummy bunkers. Your eternal rest came with a plan B and an unmarked door. While your heart got eaten by a giant demon hippo-crocodile hybrid named Amit. No pressure. The ancient Egyptians weren't casual about death. You didn't just die, you traveled across the sky, through the underworld, past terrifying monsters with crocodile heads and flaming swords. You had to recite passwords, navigate rivers of fire, and convince a divine jury that your soul was lighter than a feather. And what happened if you failed? And yet, for all this meticulous planning, your soul still wasn't safe. Because the real horror didn't come from demon serpents, it came from economics. If the state went broke, your tomb's funding dried up, which meant fewer guards, less quality limestone, maybe a missing canopic jar or two. Suddenly, your luxurious eternal resting place looked more like a half-finished Airbnb, with no guest services. Quirky tidbit: some pharaohs were buried with books of the dead rolled up like scrolls under their arms, cheat sheets for the afterlife exam. Imagine dying and needing cliff notes. But it gets worse. Let's say you die. The rituals are done. Your soul is on its way. But generations later, a new pharaoh takes the throne. He's in debt. The temple budget's a mess. And someone remembers your tomb has some really nice furniture. So they open it and chisel out your name. Take your treasures. Historians still debate whether some tombs were officially recycled by later rulers, or if it was just convenient to pretend the previous guy never really existed. Either way, you were at the mercy of people not even born yet. That wasn't just vandalism, that was deletion. If no one remembered your name, you couldn't live forever in the afterlife. So your royal legacy, your literal soul, could be erased by someone who just needed your gold chair to impress a visiting dignitary. It's one thing to fear death, it's another to fear that your body, soul, and name will be divided up and auctioned off by your great-great-grand-nephew. So pharaohs fought back the only way they could, by building tombs so elaborate, so sealed, so magically booby-trapped, that thieves would get lost before they reached the gold. False doors, hidden chambers, curse inscriptions. Some even arranged to have their burial chamber walled in after the funeral so no one, not even the builders, knew where it really was. Why? Because gold talks, especially in hard times. When droughts hit and grain prices soared, suddenly that scarab bracelet looked a lot like a bag of bread. Even some of the priests, the guys who were supposed to protect your body, turned to tomb raiding during Egypt's worst economic collapses. Divine loyalty, it turns out, has a price. And yet, they still found them. So while you parade around alive in gold sandals and leopard skin capes, you're haunted by the knowledge that your afterlife is an open target. That beautiful funerary mask might someday sit in a museum, photographed by tourists mispronouncing your name. And your mummy, moved, unwrapped, x-rayed, given a tracking number. There's even evidence that some royal mummies were used in folk medicine centuries later, ground into powders believed to cure illness. You spent your whole life being treated like a god, and your eternity ended up as someone's health supplement. So yeah, death wasn't the end of the stress. It was just a very expensive new chapter, one that came with curses, relocation plans, and constant dread that your soul's real enemy wasn't lurking in the underworld. It was living in your own palace, waiting for your tomb to be finished. If you've ever struggled to remember which fork to use at a fancy dinner, imagine managing a religious calendar that has over 2,000 gods, each with their own mood swings, preferences, temples, animal heads, and complicated backstories. As a pharaoh, your divine inbox was never empty. The gods of ancient Egypt weren't passive wallpaper. They were very involved, like drop by unannounced for tea and then demand a new obelisk involved. And since you were their physical representative on Earth, guess who had to keep them all happy? You. It wasn't just about tossing some incense on an altar and calling it a day. There were schedules, ceremonies, sacred processions with 4-hour standing times, and gold boats. You had to push across fake lakes, because symbolism. Every city had its own divine boss. One place might worship a cat-headed goddess who protects children. Another might revere a falcon-headed war god with extremely strong opinions on bread offerings. And it wasn't enough to show up and wave. You had to be fluent in ritual choreography. One hand gesture too high, one chant pronounced with the wrong inflection, and suddenly people are whispering that you've offended Sobek, the crocodile god, and that's why the flood came early and ruined the barley harvest. Mainstream historical fact: Egypt's religion was regionally decentralized, which meant different cities had their own main gods. The pharaoh had to honor them all equally, while still favoring the state god, usually Amun or Ra, depending on who was in political power. And if the balance tilted too far, that could cause political unrest. You could literally start a revolt by praising the wrong sky deity. But the real headache came from managing all the contradictions. One god might demand absolute silence during worship. Another wants chanting and clapping. One goddess loves perfume and fresh flowers. Another punishes floral offerings as impure. You had to walk a tightrope of divine etiquette that made high school drama look tame. And even with 1,000 priests handling the heavy lifting, it still came back to you, the God King. If the gods were displeased, it was your fault. Earthquake, divine anger, locusts, you forgot a hymn. Drought, someone messed up the statue oilings last week. And don't even think about skipping a festival. People might assume you were being punished, or worse, losing your connection to the divine. A pharaoh with no favor was basically just a well-dressed target. The temples themselves were massive operations, functioning more like banks and government departments than houses of worship. You weren't just visiting the gods, you were inspecting divine accounting records. Which offerings came in? How many oxen were sacrificed last month? Were the high priests properly managing the sacred beer rations? Yes, that was a thing. You remember Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to switch Egypt to monotheism. He worshipped only Aten, the sun disk, and declared all other gods obsolete. Sounds simple, right? One god, one ritual, fewer headaches. Except it tanked the economy, freaked out the priests, and nearly caused a civil war. He had to build an entirely new capital city just to make it work. Historians still argue whether he was a visionary, a fanatic, or just extremely tired of managing divine politics. And then there were the sacred animals. Imagine waking up to discover your royal pet cat is now believed to be an incarnation of Bastet, and must be paraded through town in a golden litter with backup singers. And if the cat died, oh no, full-scale funeral, mourning rituals, mummification, possibly divine succession politics, because now someone has to find the next sacred cat. Quirky tidbit: the Temple of Karnak had its own bakery, brewery, slaughterhouse, and treasury. It employed hundreds of workers, all operating under divine orders. If one of those guys shorted a bread offering by a loaf, technically they were angering a god. Some scholars even suggest that temple workers were closely watched, not just for productivity, but for signs of spiritual sabotage. Because the gods weren't just around, they were watching, all the time. Some temples kept statues of gods that were believed to come alive at night. Some gods were invisible and lived in the breeze. Others might appear in your dreams. If you ignored them, bad things happened. If you honored them improperly, worse things happened. That was real. So was the fear of forgetting someone. And of course, there were festivals. If you thought ancient parades sounded quaint, think again. Some lasted days. They required sacred boats, choreographed dancing, incense by the ton, and very expensive costumes. You had to show up in person, on a throne, smiling under the sun for hours, and when you got back, there were purification rituals, just in case you accidentally brushed against a commoner. No offense to commoners, but ancient divine etiquette was strict. Oh, the festivals. It was a 24/7 PR campaign. You weren't just managing divine relations, you were trying to stay ahead of gods who could turn into jackals or throw plagues when annoyed. And since each deity had multiple aspects, you had to track whether the crocodile-headed god today was in his benevolent healing mood or his eat-your-face mood. Your scribes had to memorize hundreds of hymns, your priests had to conduct precise lunar rituals, and you had to keep smiling like it wasn't all slowly melting your brain. So the next time you look at a statue of a calm, regal pharaoh, offering a loaf of bread to some animal-headed god, remember this, he's probably thinking, wait, was that supposed to be 3 loaves? You'd think that being the king of a giant, golden empire would at least come with a bit of personal space. A private room, a locked door, maybe even a nice quiet latrine, where nobody's watching you try to swat flies. Nope, and panicking inside. You lived in the palace. Sure, but you were never alone. Not really. The pharaoh's residence wasn't a home, it was a hive. A buzzing, whispering, constantly moving labyrinth of scribes, servants, advisors, cousins, wives, priests, guards, and attendants. There were always footsteps behind you, eyes on you, hands fixing your collar, and voices whispering prayers or reports or weather forecasts. Imagine trying to sleep while someone chants a hymn 6 feet away to protect your dreams. Even bathing was a social affair. You didn't just grab a towel and jump in, you were bathed by people trained to do it ritually correctly, which mostly meant awkward scrubbing while pretending you were too divine for armpits. The water had to be blessed. The sponges were natural. The soap, something between perfume, crushed lotus flowers, and a mystery blend that probably included leftover temple oils. You might smell good, but you'd never smell normal again. And oh, the sand, it was everywhere. Inside your sandals, inside your robes, inside your ceremonial undergarments that were never quite as breathable as the ads promised. And no matter how many linen tunics you went through, it still crept into your food, your hair, your, let's just say, private areas. Personal hygiene was important, but maintaining it while wrapped in layers of gold and symbolism in a desert climate, less than ideal. Quirky tidbit. Some ancient royals used honey as insect repellent, smearing it around the edges of their seating areas, which means you'd be lounging in your throne room, trying to look serene and godlike, while secretly hoping the bees took the hint and stayed on their side of the curtain. And privacy? Forget it. Even your most mundane activities could trigger ceremonial gossip. You sneeze? A priest is already interpreting it as a warning from the gods. You eat 2 dates instead of 1. Suddenly a scribe is wondering if you're honoring a fertility ritual. You take a slightly longer nap. The court wonders if it's symbolic of death and rebirth. You're exhausted from being exhausted. Mainstream historical fact. The royal harem, while often portrayed as a luxurious pleasure zone, was actually a sprawling administrative wing of the palace. It included not just wives and concubines, but also children, tutors, guards, and a massive logistical staff. It was more of a gated community than a romantic escape. And if you thought your family drama was intense, try juggling dozens of partners and a few hundred royal kids, each of whom might become the next god king or your downfall. There were no do not disturb signs in ancient Egypt.
And the bathrooms?
They were publicish. You had privacy screens, but attendants were never far away. Clay pots, sand scrubbers, perfumed oils, and the occasional nosy advisor accidentally popping in to discuss grain distribution mid-wipe. Even your bedroom wasn't sacred. Priests entered to perform nightly rituals, ensuring your dreams were divinely approved. Guards paced the halls. Musicians played lullabies. You might have a sleep-deprived scribe on standby just in case you murmured something prophetic in your sleep. And that bed, probably stunning, carved ebony ivory inlay, gold gilded legs, but about as comfortable as a ceremonial bench. Softness wasn't the goal, symbolism was. So while you're lying there trying to fall asleep, you're also very aware that your bed represents the sky goddess nut cradling you in eternity. Not exactly melatonin friendly, and you weren't allowed to complain. You couldn't say, "I need a moment." You couldn't throw on a hood and sneak out for a midnight stroll. Every move outside your private quarters triggered a ripple of ceremonial activity. Drums, announcements, flower petals, at least 5 people clearing the path before you walked 10 feet, even if you just wanted a snack. And if you thought gardens were a good escape, think again. The royal gardens weren't peaceful sanctuaries. They were stage sets. Beautiful, yes, with papyrus pools, imported trees, and tame ducks waddling around like divine mascots. But every step you took through them was monitored by guards and shadowed by scribes. You might be out for a walk, but you were really making a political appearance. Just without shoes. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh had any kind of private life at all. Some suggest there were secret corridors and chambers for rare solitude. Others think even those were bugged by priests. Spiritually, of course. So, royalty? Sure. But with it came a life where every cough was a cosmic signal, every nap was a state event, and every movement, yes, even that one, was observed, interpreted, recorded, and blessed. Try relaxing with all that going on. And yet, this claustrophobic existence was painted as ideal. The gods were always with you. You were never alone, because you were too important to be alone. Your body belonged to the nation. Your time belonged to the temples. Your breath was considered sacred, and therefore under management. You sit on a golden throne. The walls around you are painted with gods offering you life and eternity. There's incense in the air, lotus blossoms floating in alabaster bowls, and an official is reading aloud the tribute list from Nubia. 100 ingots of gold, 40 leopard skins, 20 elephants worth of ivory. A parade of riches flows in from every direction, piling up at your feet like divine validation. Except you can't help but notice something. You're running out of bread. Not you personally, of course. Your breakfast still arrives on a silver platter, with fig jam and honeyed beer. But out in the countryside, the granaries are strained, the taxes keep rising, and your people are growing anxious. Your economy, like your temples, is too generous for its own good. Because while you're flooding the gods with gold, the people doing the actual farming are barely scraping by. In ancient Egypt, the economy wasn't based on coins like in later civilizations. It ran on goods, grain, cattle, beer, linen. Gold was sacred, symbolic, prestigious, but you couldn't eat it. You couldn't plow a field, and for all its shine, it was mostly hoarded in temples or sent abroad to impress foreign rulers. You were rich, sure, but in very ceremonial ways. Mainstream historical fact. During the height of the New Kingdom, Egypt's tribute system sent gold, jewelry, and finely crafted goods across the Mediterranean. Other kingdoms, like the Mitanni and Hittites, practically begged for it in diplomatic letters. Egypt, in their eyes, was a bottomless treasure chest. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III sent lavish gifts abroad, not just for alliances, but for reputation. And that reputation came at a steep internal cost. Because every time a foreign ruler got a jewel-encrusted chariot, your priests got a new wing added to their temple. And every time that temple expanded, it demanded more offerings, more labor, more tax. The temples grew bigger, the economy grew thinner. And guess who had to cover the difference? Farmers, bakers, scribes, builders. Anyone who wasn't wearing gold on their ankles. You couldn't say no to them. You were supposed to ensure Ma'at, the sacred balance of the universe. But more and more, the balance sheet didn't quite add up. Your officials reported tax arrears in the Delta. Scribes quietly hinted at forged accounting scrolls. And still, the gods had to be appeased. A bad flood season, you gave more offerings. A good flood season, you gave even more, because the gods clearly deserved extra thanks. You were stuck in a celestial customer loyalty program you couldn't cancel. Quirky tidbit. In some records, priests received more beer and bread per day than most soldiers. And in lean times, temple rations didn't shrink, civilian ones did. You were at the center of the world's most magnificent machine, but that machine was eating its own wheels. And you couldn't downsize the temples. That would be sacrilege. Fewer festivals? The gods might take it as an insult. Reduce offerings? That's practically inviting famine. So instead, you leaned harder into spectacle. Bigger rituals, pricier gifts, gold statues, so heavy they needed 30 men to carry them, and all while grain prices kept rising. And if you thought about changing course, you'd be crushed under the weight of tradition. People remembered what happened to Akhenaten when he tried something new. And besides, the priesthood now held more property, wealth, and influence than most royal relatives. Try confronting that, and you'd spark a theological economic crisis. Historians still argue whether the generosity of Egypt's temple economy was intentional or simply unsustainable. Some believe pharaohs genuinely thought divine favor depended on material excess. Others suggest it was political survival, buying spiritual loyalty with gold leaf. Either way, you paid for it. Because the more you gifted, the more dependent the system became, like feeding a beast that only grew hungrier. When the state finally started breaking under the weight of its own generosity, it wasn't the gold that vanished first. It was the grain. Not with your life, with your future. People rebelled, not because they were denied jewels, but because their bread rations got cut. The world saw a kingdom of luxury, but inside, you were shuffling resources like a gambler on a losing streak, hoping to please both gods and people without triggering collapse. You knew it couldn't last. The temples couldn't keep growing forever. You couldn't keep outgiving famine. But stopping would mean cosmic imbalance. And worse, public disgrace. So you pressed on, kept smiling, kept offering, kept giving away the very things you needed to survive. And it was eating itself from the inside out. It was a generous empire, too generous. If you've ever had a bad skincare day, count yourself lucky you weren't royal in ancient Egypt, because self-care back then came with crocodile dung, eyeliner made of ground lead, and a very real chance that your perfume might explode in the sun. Sure, from the outside you looked flawless, bronze skin glowing in the torchlight, lashes darkened with kohl, hands soft from daily applications of imported oils. But behind the scene, royal beauty routines were a sensory assault course of smelly pastes, questionable science, and low-key espionage. Let's start with the basics. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and since you were technically a god, you needed to be ultra clean. That meant frequent bathing, sometimes multiple times a day, exfoliation with powdered limestone or sea salt, and the ritual application of scented balms. Your attendants would lather you with mixtures of animal fat, frankincense, and crushed flowers, all stored in ceramic jars that had to be kept cool or risk turning rancid by noon. And that wasn't even the weird stuff. Quirky tidbit: some skincare recipes preserved on papyrus include crushed beetles, boiled lettuce water, and yes, crocodile dung, used for its cooling properties and supposed magical protection. So if you're imagining spa days and lavender candles, downgrade that to pungent goo, smeared on your forehead while a priest chants about cosmic harmony. Deodorant that was a mix of citrus oils, incense smoke, and sometimes, allegedly, grounded turtle shell. The goal wasn't to stop sweating good luck with that in 40 dirkrolids, but to mask it with strong scents. The end result was something between a walking garden and a walking apothecary fire hazard. Makeup was practically armor. You never left your chamber without full kohl eyeliner, drawn thick and long to imitate the falcon god Horus. Not just because it looked fierce, but because it was believed to ward off evil spirits and eye infections. Bonus: the lead-based compounds in the kohl did have mild antibacterial properties. Downside: lead on your eyeballs every day. Mainstream historical fact: Queen Tiye and Nefertiti were known for their elaborate beauty rituals, and depictions show them wearing layers of wigs, adorned with gold diadems, perfumed cones, and intricate cosmetics. These weren't just for show, they were political statements, visual proofs of divine authority. Your nails were also a statement. They were cleaned, shaped, and painted with henna or crushed carmine beetles. Manicures were about more than vanity. They were seen as symbolic extensions of divine order. The cleaner your nails, the more spiritually aligned you appeared. And if your nails were chipped during a ceremony, bad omen. Cue emergency repolishing while the priest stalled with extra chanting. But there was always danger beneath the glam. And while the beauty products were high-end, they were also incredibly flammable. Perfumed oils sometimes caught fire under direct sun. One story even tells of a priest's sleeve catching alight after a blessing session with too much resin. If you smelled good, you were a walking candle. Wigs were heavy, hot, and itchy. Often made from human hair mixed with palm fibers, they were affixed using beeswax or animal fat. During hot festivals, those waxes melted, wigs slipped, scalp burns happened. You'd be waving to the adoring crowd while a personal attendant frantically tried to realign your divine hairpiece with a spatula and a prayer. And yes, your manicurist might be a spy, because who else had such easy, frequent, up-close access to the Pharaoh's body? The person massaging your scalp could be bribed. The one applying your eyeliner might be slipping in something that burned. Royal grooming staff were often screened, trained, and monitored, because even a cuticle injury could be interpreted as divine weakness. Historians still argue whether grooming mishaps actually led to dethronings, or if the fear of them simply kept the court in a constant state of hairsprayed anxiety. Even sleep wasn't simple. You wore perfumed wax cones on your head during festivals and formal evenings, cones that melted slowly, releasing fragrance as the night went on. Sounds elegant, right? Unless the cones slid into your eyes, or your pillow, or the linen canopy above you. And if you got a pimple, forget it. You'd get smeared with incense ash and wrapped in linen strips like a mini mummy until it's spiritually resolved, because any blemish could be seen as a sign from the gods, or worse, an opportunity for political enemies to question your purity. If your cheek looked blotchy during a procession, someone was already sketching it into a rumor. So here you were, the most powerful person in the kingdom, decked out in gold and myrrh, lips stained with crushed berries, toenails painted with spiritual lacquer, and absolutely terrified that your eyeliner might smudge in the heat. Because beauty wasn't optional, it was identity. You were divine, and divine beings didn't sweat. They shimmered, and if you didn't, well, there was always another relative waiting in the wings, coal stick in hand. The festival trumpet blasts. The priests chant your name in rhythmic staccato. Flowers are tossed into the air, like confetti, some of them wilting before they even hit the sandstone. And you're standing on a golden chariot, wearing 30 pounds of jewelry, baking in the midday sun, while pretending that yes, this is fun. Public appearances were mandatory, not just because your subjects needed to see you, but because they needed to see you thriving, strong, radiant, unfazed by the heat, the weight, the absurd length of the procession route. You were the living embodiment of divine order, after all. So when the festival of Opet rolled around, or a victory parade through Thebes was scheduled, you had to show up and shine, literally. One mainstream historical fact: during the annual festival of Opet, the pharaoh was paraded in a ceremonial bark, a giant golden boat from Karnak Temple to Luxor, accompanied by priests, dancers, and musicians. It symbolized the rejuvenation of royal power, and it lasted days, with lots of standing. But the reality of it, utterly exhausting. You couldn't wear sunscreen unless you counted a thin layer of ceremonial oil that made you smell like a sanctified pine cone and feel like a buttered duck. You couldn't squint against the glare either, because any frown might be read as a sign of weakness, divine displeasure, or a political statement. So you smiled and waved for hours. Sometimes, the festivals came one after another, clumped into calendar months, dictated by lunar phases and divine anniversaries. And everyone required a different costume, a different sacred chant, a different boat, animal sacrifice, or awkward ceremonial dance. You weren't attending a party, you were the party. And if your sandal strap broke mid-procession, that was a bad omen. Someone might end up fired or sacrificed. And yes, you could absolutely die from over-parading. Heat stroke? Common. Dehydration? Constant risk. But stopping wasn't an option. If you collapsed during the Festival of the Valley, that could mean the god Amun was withdrawing his favor. So you kept standing, kept smiling, kept absorbing the desert sun like it was a privilege. And don't even get me started on what you were wearing. Festival garb wasn't designed for comfort. Your crown alone could weigh nearly 10 pounds, depending on which version the priest declared appropriate. The double crown, red and white, symbolizing the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt, looked regal. It also felt like someone was slowly tightening a clay pot around your skull. Add in gold collars, pectorals, wrist cuffs, rings on every finger, and those heavy ceremonial kilts with ornate pleats. You were basically a walking jewelry display with heat exhaustion. Quirky tidbit: some royal processions featured sacred animals, like bulls or crocodiles, dressed in golden masks and sashes. If the animal misbehaved, say the bull tripped or the crocodile refused to smile, it was taken as a divine sign. You could end up having to stop everything and conduct a purification rite while continuing to sweat under 4 layers of linen. The priests didn't make things easier. They were trained to chant non-stop, rhythmically and loudly, invoking blessings and recounting your divine heritage in real time. You had to stay on beat, stay upright, and not wince when the conch horns blared 2 inches from your ear. The people expected serenity. You gave them serenity, or at least a glazed, heat-drunk approximation of it. Historians still debate whether the pharaoh truly believed he was divine, or simply played the part under pressure. But either way, the performance had to be perfect, not because the people loved you, but because they needed to believe you were in control. You weren't just their ruler. You were their insurance policy against chaos, famine, war, and crocodile uprisings. Those happened. And if you skipped a parade, if you were too ill, too busy, or simply didn't feel like it, there would be consequences. Whispers of divine disfavor, maybe even rebellion. One pharaoh reportedly missed a key festival appearance and had to issue an emergency stone stela, claiming he was with the gods in Isit. Damage control, ancient style. Your hands couldn't shake. Your voice couldn't crack. You couldn't get dizzy or sunburned or overwhelmed. You weren't allowed to sneeze, cough, or be visibly bitten by the sacred ibis that someone decided should be part of the ceremony this year. Because the pharaoh doesn't falter, he reigns. So there you were, majestic, polished, golden, and slowly cooking alive. You dreamed of shade, of water, of taking off the pectoral that had fused to your chest with sweat and incense dust. But instead, you raised your scepter, offered a carefully rehearsed prayer to the gods, and gave your most regal nod to the crowd, who erupted in cheers, not because they loved you necessarily, but because they had to. Because seeing you meant everything was still in order, that the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, the crops would grow. Your ankles might be swollen, and your wig glue might be dripping down your neck, but to them, you were perfection. So you kept waving. The limestone is blinding in the midday sun. Dust clogs your nose. Somewhere, a whip cracks, though you pretended not to hear it. You're standing at the foot of what will be your eternal resting place, a pyramid, obelisk, or valley tomb, the size of a modern football stadium. It's meant to be glorious, a testament to your divinity, a beacon of immortality. But let's not kid ourselves. It's also bleeding you dry, because the bigger your monument, the bigger the target on your back. And not just from future grave robbers, we already talked about those. This is different. This is the kind of resentment that simmers with every limestone block hauled uphill, the kind that builds up one pyramid at a time. See, every stone they stack, every golden statue they carve, every magical inscription they chisel into sandstone walls. They're not just preserving your soul, they're draining your empire, in manpower, in resources, in patience. Mainstream historical fact. Building monumental tombs and temples wasn't done by slaves in chains, as pop culture likes to think. It was done by teams of skilled laborers, artisans, architects, and engineers, paid in food, beer, and tax exemptions. But even so, the scale was brutal. The workers at Deir el-Medina, who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, went on strike during the reign of Ramses III, when their rations were delayed. The world's first recorded labor strike, and it happened because a pharaoh couldn't pay his grave team. You'd think someone would take the hint. But no, pharaohs had to one-up each other. You couldn't just build a nice tomb, You had to build the tomb, bigger, deeper, with more magical protection spells, better gold, and let's be honest, more risk. Because the larger the construction, the more people you had to command, and the more people you commanded, the more people secretly hoped a granite block might accidentally land on your foot. You weren't just building a grave, you were building enemies. People noticed. Farmers resented their fields being requisitioned to grow food for tomb workers. Regional governors rolled their eyes as their tax quotas doubled. Priests worried about whether their temples would get overshadowed. And all of it funneled back to you. Quirky tidbit. One pharaoh, Sneferu, built 3 pyramids during his reign, not because he was indecisive, but because the first 2 had structural issues. By the third, his workers had probably started dreaming of desert retirement plans. And as your monument grew, your time vanished. Inspecting plans, approving designs, performing rituals to consecrate building sites, negotiating with your vizier about the brick budget, all while pretending this wasn't all about your personal death anxiety. And it really was. Because you knew that if your tomb wasn't built right, if a wall cracked, a spell was written wrong, or your mummy was placed 6 inches too far west, your soul could get lost in the underworld forever. Or worse, end up in someone else's tomb, labeled as miscellaneous. Historians still argue whether the giant tombs of the Old Kingdom were truly about spiritual legacy, or just extreme political messaging. Look at my massive pyramid, peasant. Don't even think about rebellion. Either way, the burden was real, and the cost wasn't just gold, it was goodwill. Every stone had to be blessed, every corridor inscribed, every fake door carved to trick potential tomb robbers. You weren't designing an afterlife. You were micromanaging a trap-filled puzzle box that would make Indiana Jones weep. And yet the people working on it? Half of them believed in what they were building. The other half just wanted their beer rations on time. And the third half, because yes, your stress made you bad at fractions, secretly prayed that all this effort might be for nothing and someone would steal your stuff anyway. Because you know what no one tells you, the better your tomb, the more likely it gets looted. It's like hanging a neon sign over your mummy. All the gold is right here. So even while your royal artists paint your face on the tomb wall with that smug eternal stare, you're quietly wondering if they're going to sell your nose to a merchant in 20 years. And yet, you keep building. Because what else can you do? You're a god, a king, a legacy carved in granite. You can't exactly say, actually, I'll just go with a modest stone box and some tasteful hieroglyphs. People would panic. Priests would mutter. Your enemies would pounce. A pharaoh without a monument, that's a prophecy of collapse. So you play the game. You act proud as your obelisk is raised. You pretend the labor strikes didn't sting. You smile as your vizier assures you the new shipment of cedar wood has arrived safely from Lebanon. It didn't, pirate. And all the while, the thing you're building slowly becomes your burden, your obsession, your legacy, and your liability. Tied together in limestone and sweat. You were supposed to rest in peace. But first, you had to build yourself into a prison. The courier bows low, holding out a scroll sealed with beeswax and hope. It's from a distant land, perhaps Mitanni, or Babylon, or that upstart Hittite king again. The message inside is flowery, respectful, and packed with passive-aggressive praise. To the great king of Egypt, son of the sun, may your livestock prosper, and your wives be as numerous as the stars. It ends with a simple request. Please marry my daughter, or else. Because in the world of pharaohs, diplomacy wasn't waged with swords. It was waged with weddings. Arranged marriages weren't just tradition. They were international strategy. You didn't send ambassadors to cement alliances. You sent daughters, or in your case, welcomed them. A royal wife from a foreign land meant peace, trade deals, and political leverage. It also meant sleeping next to someone who might be spying on you for her father. Mainstream historical fact. Pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramses II took foreign brides from powerful empires, often under the expectation that these marriages would ensure stable political ties. Sometimes, diplomatic letters included requests for gold as part of the dowry, or even negotiations over how many servants the bride could bring. Of course, you never married your own daughters off abroad. That was beneath Egypt. You were the center of the universe. Everyone else, orbiting dust. So when a king wrote asking for a marriage alliance, it was always phrased delicately. He wasn't saying, "Give me your daughter." He was saying, "Allow my house to bask in the light of your divine seed." That kind of nonsense. But make no mistake, the politics were real, and so were the risks. Because that foreign princess now living in your palace. She came with an entourage, tutors, advisors. Possibly a priest or two, all of them loyal to their homeland, not to you. One misstep, and you had a pocket of foreign influence in your own palace, whispering in corridors, gathering intelligence, maybe even conspiring. Quirky tidbit. One Babylonian king wrote multiple complaints to Egypt that his daughter wasn't being treated like a full queen. He demanded more gold, more gifts, and a guarantee that she had her own palace wing. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a Yelp review, and proof that the brides didn't just sit quietly in a corner. And if she wasn't happy, that became your problem. A moody queen could mean a furious father. A furious father could mean trade embargoes. Or worse, an army. Of course, you didn't really know your new bride. You probably didn't speak the same language. Your scribes had to translate love poems. Your priests had to explain your gods, and you had to smile through ceremonial dinners while wondering if the stew was laced with foreign herbs or something less culinary. And yet you still had to keep marrying, because every new wife bought you time. Time without war, time to focus on pyramid construction or another solar temple, time to not worry about arrows flying over the border. But that time came with a personal cost. Your court grew more complicated. Each foreign wife brought her own customs, expectations, and drama. The Egyptian wives didn't like being outranked by a Babylonian girl who wore her hair funny and asked too many questions. The foreign wives didn't appreciate being sidelined in favor of your mother's cousin's daughter, who technically had divine blood. It was a harem, yes, but it was also a chessboard. Every alliance mattered. Every gesture was analyzed. Who sat next to you during the banquet? Who got the golden anklet? Who bore your first son, and would that son be considered legitimate? Historians still argue whether foreign wives had real influence or were kept in decorative confinement. Some evidence suggests they maintained correspondence with their home countries. Others may have secretly worshipped their own gods, possibly influencing minor palace cults. Some might have plotted, some definitely gossiped. All were players in a very high-stakes game. And you had to keep smiling. Because if you showed favoritism, someone in the harem got jealous. If you ignored a wife, her homeland might accuse you of disrespect. If you accidentally called the Matani princess by the wrong name, well, good luck getting that copper shipment next season. There was no real love here, just logistics. Every hug was a political pact. Every child born was a potential heir, and a potential civil war. Your family tree wasn't a gentle diagram of affection. It was a diplomatic minefield with hieroglyphs. And when you looked across the banquet hall at your wives and consorts, you didn't see romance. You saw treaties, maps, armies held at bay, temporary peace, wrapped in silk, crowned with diadem. So next time you picture the Pharaoh at home, lounging with his many wives in fragrant luxury, remember this. Those pillows were stuffed with paranoia. Those smiles were political masks. And the love poems, proofread by translators who also moonlighted as spies. You married for peace. But peace always had a price. You wake up with a pounding head and a throat like sandpaper. Maybe it's the heat. Maybe it's the 6 straight hours of festival chanting you did yesterday. Maybe it's the suspect daked wine from your cousin's wedding. Doesn't matter. You're Pharaoh. You're divine. You don't get sick. Except you very much do. But admitting that? Unthinkable. Because in a world where your health is directly tied to the health of the kingdom, a single cough isn't just a personal problem, it's a national crisis. If the Pharaoh sneezes, is it a sign that Ma'at, the divine order of the universe, is cracking? Will the Nile stop flooding? Will the gods withdraw their favor and let chaos devour Egypt? Better to fake it. You force your way through the morning ritual, smile for the priests, and recite your blessings like your voice isn't cracking on every syllable. Your servants notice, of course. One drops your cup, another bows too low. They're afraid. Not for you. Well, maybe a little. but mostly for what your illness means. Because if the God King can't walk straight, the very foundations of the empire start to wobble. Mainstream historical fact: pharaohs were often surrounded by court physicians trained in both practical and spiritual medicine. Some remedies actually worked, like using moldy bread on wounds. Thanks, penicillin. But many relied on charms, spells, and incantations. Sickness was seen as both a physical and spiritual event, often requiring both herbs and prayers to fix. Quirky tidbit: some pharaohs slept with amulets shaped like tiny frogs, lions, or vultures under their pillows to ward off nighttime spirits. There was even a practice of dream diagnosis, where a priest would interpret your dreams and suggest treatments, like rub your feet with ostrich fat, or avoid onions for 3 days. So if you had a stomachache, you got poultices, incantations, and possibly a sacred figurine of a hippo goddess buried under your bed. You didn't just heal, you restored harmony. And if that didn't work, the priest-doctors blamed demons, bad dreams, or your enemies casting spells on your sweat. But what if your illness lingered? Well then, came the rumor. Maybe the gods were angry. Maybe your bloodline was impure. Maybe your foreign wife had brought her homeland's gods into your court, and now they were fighting behind your liver. Whatever the theory, you couldn't let it show, so you kept up appearances, stood a little straighter, wore a bit more makeup. If you needed to collapse, you did it in private, behind 7 locked doors and 3 layers of ceremonial curtains. And even then, someone was outside chanting for your swift recovery. Sometimes, even your closest advisors didn't know the truth. Your vizier might notice you looking pale, but if he mentioned it, you'd smile tightly and remind him that Ra's light shines strongest when tested. Because that's what was expected. You were the sun, the unchanging, the unbroken. And if you did die unexpectedly, well, then your scribes had some rewriting to do. Historians still argue whether some pharaohs died suddenly or were sick for years and simply hid it well. Tutankhamun, for instance, may have suffered from multiple genetic disorders, scoliosis, and malaria, all of which would have been nearly impossible to admit to without shaking the entire structure of Egyptian theology. His statues always showed him standing tall, but CT scans tell a different story. And so, you attended rituals with a fever. You greeted diplomats with nausea rolling in your gut. You signed proclamations while wondering if you were dying or just suffering divine indigestion. And if you had to excuse yourself from a ceremony, it wasn't illness, it was a private audience with the gods. They didn't say he caught an infection and keeled over. No, they said he ascended to the stars, or the gods called him home. Which, to be fair, sounds a lot better than he sneezed, tripped, and was never the same. So you faked wellness like it was your job, because weakness was contagious, not just biologically, but politically. One sign of frailty, and your enemies perked up. The priests started whispering. The generals weighed succession options. Maybe your cousin had a stronger jawline. Maybe the Nile would flood better under someone who didn't limp during ceremonies. Because it was, even in your own bed, sweating through your embroidered linens and whispering prayers to deities you hadn't spoken to in years, you couldn't show fear. The people didn't need a mortal king. They needed a sunbeam in human form. So you painted your face, put on your crown, and told them you were fine. Especially when you weren't. Even when you weren't, the army lost. Badly. You were supposed to be leading them into a glorious victory, blessed by the gods, and recorded forever in temple carvings. Instead, your general limped home with half the chariots smashed, the standard bearers missing, and rumors swirling faster than the desert wind. You should be panicking. But instead, you're sitting with your head scribe, deciding how to spin the disaster into something a little more heroic. The scribes get to work immediately. No, the army wasn't defeated. It was strategically repositioned, under divine instruction. The enemy wasn't victorious. They were allowed to survive as a lesson. And your temporary retreat, that was obviously part of a larger cosmic plan the gods whispered to you mid-battle. Because in ancient Egypt, pharaohs didn't lose, at least, not publicly. Mainstream historical fact: Pharaoh Ramses II famously claimed a solo victory at the Battle of Kadesh, where in reality, the battle was more of a draw, or even a narrow escape. Yet on temple walls, across Egypt, he's seen charging alone into enemy lines, scattering Hittites like ants, a masterclass in ancient propaganda. Your soldiers might be grumbling in the taverns, your generals might be furious, but the temples, they're already carving murals of your glorious divine presence striking down foreign foes like thunder. And those foreign leaders? They're probably writing the same thing. Quirky tidbit, the Hittites also claimed victory at Kadesh. Both sides inscribed their own version of events, complete with divine support and heroic metaphors. Somewhere, two kings were both claiming they won the same battle. Centuries before social media made that a daily habit. You weren't lying. Not really. You were crafting legacy. And it wasn't just for public consumption. It was also for the gods. Because your afterlife depended on it. And this wasn't a one-off. Every pharaoh maintained a team of royal scribes, artists, and public relations priests, whose job was to immortalize greatness, even when reality begged to differ. Crops failed? Blame the local governors. Border skirmish? Call it a divine test. An economic crash? Just say the gods were restructuring abundance. If the gods believed you maintained Ma'at, the sacred cosmic balance, you got the deluxe eternal suite. But if they saw weakness, failure, or dishonor, you risked being eaten by Ammit, the soul-snacking demon hippo crocodile. So yeah, you edited. You didn't abandon a city due to rebellion. You magnanimously allowed local governance to flourish under divine guidance. You didn't raise taxes. You balanced sacred obligations to the temple. You didn't cancel the Northern Festival because of budget cut. You postponed the celebration, pending more favorable omens. Once something was inscribed on a temple wall, it became truth. Not metaphorically, literally. If you had a bad year, you could just not mention it. Future generations would never know. And the gods? Hopefully, too busy judging someone else's soul to notice the omission. And every one of these events was dutifully carved in stone. Historians still debate whether pharaohs believed their own spin. Some may have genuinely thought they were doing the gods' will, even when things went sideways. Others were just excellent at playing the long game. After all, if no one ever records your losses, did they really happen? But the illusion came at a cost. So you kept your scribes close, kept your artists busy. If the mural didn't show you trampling your enemies beneath celestial beams of sunlight, it got redone, and anyone who questioned it, silent, or worse, assigned to menial work in a remote village full of mosquitoes and theological re-education scrolls. You lived in fear of cracks, not just in the walls, but in the story. One leak, one loose-tongued official, one temple worker who whispered, "Actually, he cried after that battle," and the whole divine facade trembled. You even had propaganda rituals. One involved parading statues of you defeating chaos in symbolic form, a bound foreigner, a snake, or sometimes a clay model of your most annoying neighbor. You'd strike it with a sacred mace in front of cheering priests. And just like that, order was restored, or at least the illusion of it. Because that's what it all was. Illusion. A polished performance. A world built from carefully stacked lies and sunlit metaphors. You weren't just managing a kingdom, you were stage directing a cosmic theater. But inside, you remembered the battlefield mud, the terrified horses, the look on your general's face when the enemy broke the left flank, the way your sandals stuck in the blood-slick dust. You knew the truth, but you couldn't show it. Then you stepped outside, smiled at the crowd, and became the legend they needed you to be. So you nodded to your scribe, approved the version where your enemies were humbled. The gods applauded, and your victory resounded through eternity. Not an assassin, not a rebellious general, it's your scribe. It's the middle of the night, and someone's creeping down the hallway. He's there to write down your dreams, because every flicker of your subconscious, every strangely vivid bird, melting star, or mysterious woman handing you a basket of figs, might be a message from the gods. And since you are technically part god, those messages matter. A lot. Your dreams belong to the kingdom. There are no private thoughts when you're Pharaoh. In ancient Egypt, dreams weren't weird little stories about showing up to school in your underwear. They were divine telegrams, prophecies, warnings, and for the Pharaoh, they were state secrets and celestial reports rolled into one. The court had trained dream readers, priests who specialized in interpreting every detail. A lion in your dream. Good. A crocodile. Depends. A cucumber. Uh-oh. Better have the scribes check the archives. So every morning a priest might gently nudge you awake and ask, "Did you dream of boats again, great one?" Then they'd gather around, listening as you recounted every surreal detail, half asleep, probably under anointed oils and still reeking of incense from the evening's purification ritual. Mainstream historical fact. Egyptians compiled dream books, literal catalogues of symbols and their meanings. One surviving fragment lists hundreds of dream scenarios with interpretations like, "If a man dreams of drinking warm beer, it means misfortune will follow." Honestly, that one still checks out. And God's help you if your dream didn't make sense. Because interpretation wasn't just about curiosity, it was about stability. A pharaoh with confusing or disturbing dreams could signal divine unrest. If the dreams got dark, swarming insects, collapsing temples, forgotten rituals, your court might launch emergency prayers, spontaneous fasts, or even a recalibration of temple schedules. No pressure. And the dream scribes? Oh, they knew things. They were quiet, ever-present, observant, and terrifyingly thorough. They didn't just record your dreams. They tracked your food, your sleep quality, your emotional state. They noticed when your tone shifted mid-sentence or when you started scratching your shoulder while discussing omens. Was that nervousness or prophecy? Quirky tidbit. One pharaoh was rumored to have altered his entire royal calendar because he dreamt of a baboon holding a scepter. The resulting date shuffle caused confusion among priests and tax officials for years. But hey, better safe than cosmically cursed. And this wasn't just about sleep. Even your conversations weren't safe. Every part of your life was documented by scribes. When you ate, what you wore, how many steps you took in the temple, which direction your shadow pointed during a blessing, all of it, your bowel movements, tracked, your sneezes, counted, your sneezes in the presence of foreigners, possibly interpreted as divine communication or deliberate intimidation. Historians still argue whether some scribes served more as surveillance agents than record keepers. In some periods, the bureaucracy got so bloated that layers of scribes were assigned just to report on each other. You couldn't pick up a cup of wine without someone taking notes on your grip. Let's say you had a casual chat with a high priest about reducing festival costs. 10 minutes later, that conversation was on a scroll in the archives, flagged, analyzed, and possibly turned into a debate about whether the gods were being disrespected. One misworded sentence, and you could trigger a theological meltdown. And yet, you couldn't stop talking, or dreaming, or living, because silence would be suspicious. Withdraw too much, and rumors would start. Speak too freely, and whispers would swirl. So you played the game, and you made sure your scribes recorded those dreams. Not the real ones. You offered deliberate dreams, dreams you didn't actually have, that told them anyway. You whispered about visions of rising sunbeams and talking falcons, something vague but flattering, something they could carve into temple walls, something that made you look tuned in to the divine Wi-Fi, not the ones where your enemies laugh from the shadows, not the ones where your father's face fades into a storm cloud, not the one where you're buried alive beneath your own tomb while a younger prince wears your crown. Those stay inside. So you smiled. You described the baboon again. You gave them what they wanted, because if they get out, someone might interpret them. Someone might think it's a sign. Someone might think it's time for a new dreamer on the throne. Born into royalty? Congratulations, you've just lost your freedom. And later, when you were finally alone, you tried desperately to forget what you really dreamed about. From the moment you took your first breath in the palace nursery, surrounded by gold rattles, perfumed linen, and attendants bowing even before you could lift your own head, your future was already sealed. And no, it wasn't a pick-your-own-adventure scenario. You were either going to be a priest, a pawn, or a prematurely embalmed disappointment. Mainstream historical fact. Royal sons and daughters were commonly appointed to priesthoods or temple administration positions as early as childhood. Being a priest wasn't optional, it was your royal duty. At age 12, you might already be leading rituals you barely understood, wearing leopard skin cloaks, and blessing food you weren't allowed to eat. Because being a royal kid in ancient Egypt wasn't about playtime and pony rides. It was about training, expectation, and getting locked into a path you didn't choose. Your future was scripted before you even stopped drooling. Let's say you're a boy, and second or third in line for the throne. That sounds exciting, until you realize that your options are become a priest and serve your brother's reign in silence, marry strategically into another noble house, and disappear into ceremonial obscurity, or try to challenge your sibling and end up mysteriously missing during a family boating trip. And if you weren't useful? If you were a girl, your fate depended entirely on who your father decided you'd marry. Could be a local noble, could be your half-brother, could be a foreign king, old enough to remember the last comet. Romantic. You might get crowned Great Royal Wife, a title that sounded glamorous, until you realized it came with endless ceremonies, fertility expectations, and the constant creeping dread of childbirth without painkillers. Not to mention the politics. Oh, the politics. Well, enjoy your nice little room in the palace's forgotten wing. You'd live a life of embroidery, ceremonial appearances, and wondering whether anyone even remembered your name. Royal children were trained from an absurdly young age, not in games, not in imagination, but in decorum, divine order, public performance. You learned to bow, bless, chant, and sit still for hours, while your tutor explained why your existence symbolized the cosmic harmony between sky and earth. Quirky tidbit. One princess, Meritaten, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, may have briefly ruled Egypt under a different name, or she may have been used as a placeholder for a dying dynasty. Scholars can't quite agree, but either way, her life was more chess piece than crown. Your toys, miniature tools and ceremonial objects, tiny scepters, practice scrolls, model offering tables, no dolls unless they represented goddesses, no fun unless it involved chanting, no running unless it was part of a festival rehearsal. Even your playmates were selected for political neutrality. No one too ambitious, no one from a family with succession claims. Just quiet, obedient little nobles in training who bowed when you passed and tattled when you said anything interesting. And heaven forbid you ask questions. Why can't I eat that bread? Because it's for the gods. Why can't I go outside the palace? Because you're sacred. Why can't I be an artist instead? Because Maat says no. Historians still argue whether royal children had any personal agency. Some texts suggest certain princes showed rebellious streaks, preferring hunting over temple duties. Others hint that rebellious sons were quietly moved to distant provinces. Not punished, just removed from the narrative. And then there's the constant pressure. You belonged to Egypt. Your thoughts, your body, your future. All tools of statecraft. Your bedtime stories were epic sagas about Ra's battle with darkness, not gentle lullabies. You slept in a bed shaped like a lion, beneath a ceiling painted with stars, while priests whispered spells to protect your dreams, which sounds beautiful, until you realize it's all because you're already being prepared for your afterlife. You're watched by tutors, advisors, servants, guards, and scribes. Every word recorded. Every mistake noted. You spill some ink on a scroll? Your nurse apologizes to the gods. You cry during a thunderstorm. A priest reassures everyone that it's a divine emotional overflow, not a sign of weakness. The halls of the palace echo with chants and gold, but they're not wide enough for dreams. Not really, because your life is already boxed into rituals, costumes, and responsibilities you didn't ask for. You don't even get to pick your own nickname. No one told you that being royal would feel this confined. And if you ever looked out beyond the palace wall and wondered what it would be like to live a normal life, to walk barefoot in the fields, to eat warm flatbread from a street vendor, to laugh without checking if a priest heard you, you'd be reminded very gently that such things are not for people like you. You are not a child, you are a symbol, and symbols don't run away, they just endure. It's mid-afternoon, the sun hangs directly above, baking the palace tiles to the temperature of fresh-baked pottery. You've been standing perfectly still for nearly 3 hours, draped in linen, gold, and divine expectations. Why? Because it's time for the seasonal offering to Ra, and apparently, Nothing says sacred harmony like sweating profusely under 10 pounds of ceremonial regalia. And then finally they place the crown on your head. It's heavy, it's hot, and it itches like it was lined with hay and bee stingers. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Egyptian pharaohs wore different crowns depending on the occasion. The white crown, Hijjet, symbolized Upper Egypt. The red crown, Deshret, stood for Lower Egypt. The combined version, the Shent, represented unified Egypt, and also a full-on neck workout. Then there was the Nimis headcloth, the Kepresh, blue war crown, and several ornamental headdresses covered in gold, beads, and occasionally, just to spice things up, vulture motifs. The truth is, Egyptian crowns weren't comfortable. They weren't even functional. They were symbolic, and symbols, as you've probably learned by now, don't care much for practicality. And you wore them all, often in rapid succession, each requiring a specific posture, gesture, prayer, and walking pace, each with its own rules. Ever tried balancing a tall, rigid crown shaped like a bowling pin while processing across an uneven courtyard, surrounded by priests, goats, incense smoke, and 30 musicians, all playing different instruments? Let's just say it's not ideal for your vertebrae. Because these weren't just accessories, they were manifestations of cosmic legitimacy. If you dropped one or wore the wrong one, it wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was divine treason, and probably a bad omen for the next flood season. But you couldn't complain. Your ceremonial kilt was stiff from gold threading. Your sandals were stylish but about as breathable as a clay tablet. You were supposed to glide like a sunbeam. You moved like someone trying not to dislocate a hip. And the worst part, you had to pretend it was comfortable. You had to look like you enjoyed it. Like the sweat trickling down your spine was an offering. Like the sun cooking your scalp through your ceremonial wig was just another divine blessing. Quirky tidbit: some pharaohs were buried with multiple crowns. Not just one, not even two, sometimes 7 or more. Each one was meant to equip them for different phases of the afterlife, which, judging by the amount of gold involved, must have had a pretty strict dress code. You sat on thrones made of ebony, ivory, and stone, not a cushion in sight. You were presented with heavy scepters that required real forearm strength. You stood during most public ceremonies, even the ones that lasted hours. The throne room didn't come with ergonomic considerations. But in life, it wasn't just about clothing. The weight of rule was everywhere. Not metaphorically, physically. Historians still argue whether these crowns and outfits were worn daily or just for ceremonies. Some believe they were reserved for state occasions. Others suggest certain headdresses were worn often enough to cause real health issues. Migraines, neck pain, possibly even skin conditions from constant friction and sweat. And while the royal court saw your adorned silhouette as divine majesty, you knew the truth. Under that beaded collar was a rash. Under that gold crown, a headache. Inside that stiff ceremonial posture, a very tired spine that had not properly reclined in days. The more sacred the object, the less it was designed for human comfort. And of course, there was the sun. The relentless, glorious, sacred sun. It baked your temples, steamed your headdress, and turned your crown into a personal oven. If you flinched, people interpreted it. If you squinted, a priest whispered omens. If you fainted, immediate damage control, rituals, re-blessings, possibly even replacing the high priest just in case he'd accidentally cursed your sandals. But did anyone suggest building some shade? No, because light was sacred, visibility was divine. And if the people didn't see you suffer through the ceremony, did it even happen? So you stood, sweltered, smiled. Because your discomfort wasn't just accepted, it was required. Every drop of sweat was part of the show, and it never let you forget who was really in charge. You didn't wear the crown wore you. Every aching tendon, a silent affirmation of your devotion. But really, you just want to scream. You're sitting in the audience chamber, surrounded by advisors, scribes, and priests, who smell faintly of incense and old papyrus. The scroll in your hand outlines yet another land dispute between two noble families, both claiming their ancestors once fished the same stretch of Nile. You're supposed to resolve it, fairly, divinely, wisely, because divine kingship wasn't about ruling, it was about obeying. Mainstream historical fact. Maat was the ancient Egyptian concept of divine order, justice, and balance. It wasn't just a philosophical idea, it was a literal goddess, a feather, and the framework for how the universe functioned. Pharaohs were believed to uphold Maat by delivering fair judgments, maintaining peace, and supporting the temples. To act against Maat was to invite cosmic collapse. You answered to Maat, not the people, not the laws, not even your heart. So every decision you made wasn't just political, it was cosmic. But Maat didn't govern alone. She had some colleagues. Every grain tax, border treaty, or priestly appointment carried the weight of eternal balance. Mess it up, and the gods might send a plague, or a drought, or an ominous dream, featuring talking hippos. No pressure, because behind all the divine fanfare, you were still one person in a palace filled with agendas. Viziers, high priests, generals, temple scribes, your supposed advisors, they surrounded you at all times, bowed deeply, spoke softly, called you son of Ra, and occasionally steered you like a chariot, with one missing wheel. The vizier wanted more temple funding, the generals wanted a campaign in Nubia, the priesthood wanted another obelisk, as if one wasn't enough. And you wanted anyone, to stop citing sacred scrolls every time you tried to make a basic decision, because Maat had to be upheld. And if your vizier, said Maat favored his cousin's temple, getting 200 new goats, you listened. If the high priest of Amun insisted Maat required a week-long incense ritual that cost more than your yearly linen budget, you nodded solemnly and approved it, even when you suspected they were just making things up as they went. But you couldn't just say no. The courts were packed with appeals. Land, inheritance, priestly disputes, construction permits, and while you were technically the highest judge in the land, most of these were filtered, spun, and presented by scribes who knew exactly how to angle things to fit their patrons' interests. Quirky tidbit. Some pharaohs kept multiple advisors from different regions just to balance out temple politics. The goal, prevent any one group from dominating court decisions. The result, twice the politics, half the clarity, and the law. There wasn't a nice tidy book of statutes. Everything had to be interpreted through Maat, through precedent, through dreams, through the mood of the gods that day, as reported by whatever priest had drawn the short reed for divine communications. You were supposed to be the bringer of justice, but some days you felt more like a glorified translator between one corrupt faction and another. One temple accused another of hoarding grain. That temple retaliated by claiming the accuser's sacred goose was unclean, and you had to rule with balance, with fairness. Historians still debate how much actual authority the pharaoh had over the sprawling bureaucracy. Some suggest the king was more symbolic, a divine figurehead carried along by priests and administrators. Others argue that strong-willed pharaohs, like Thutmose III or Ramses III, personally oversaw major reforms. But even those powerhouses had to bow, if not to men, then to tradition, with absolutely no sarcasm. They didn't care that your vizier was skimming off the royal granaries. They didn't want to hear about temple politics. They just wanted the river to flood on time, the bread to be affordable, and the sun to rise each morning with reassuring consistency. Because Maat had no flexibility clause, and the people expected results. And slowly, the weight of that balance began to warp your spine. Not metaphorically, literally. So you made rulings you didn't agree with, supported festivals you couldn't afford, commissioned monuments you didn't need, all in the name of sacred balance. Your posture changed. You bowed slightly more often. Your voice took on that ceremonial lilt. You started speaking in phrases like, "Let harmony be preserved," when what you really meant was, "I know this is nonsense, but we can't afford a curse right now." Because that's what Maat demanded, not perfection, but performance. A show of order, an appearance of peace, a kingdom that, on the surface, glittered with harmony. Even if underneath the surface, the crocodiles were circling. You stopped asking, "Is this right?" and started asking, "Will this maintain the illusion?" Even if it cost you your peace. And you kept the balance. It starts with a sacred dream, or maybe a priest sees a comet, or a scribe declares that a forgotten relic has begun to hum. Either way, the gods are calling, and you're expected to answer. It's time for a pilgrimage, and as Pharaoh, you're the main event. Not a quiet retreat, not a royal vacation, a full-blown, gold-plated, priest-packed, multi-week ordeal that's part religious duty, part PR stunt, and entirely exhausting. Mainstream historical fact: pharaohs were expected to visit key religious centers and perform rituals in person. These journeys could stretch across hundreds of kilometers, requiring massive logistical support, processional boats, guards, supplies, and entire squadrons of priests. The route was ritually significant. The ritual had to be exact. The journey itself was a public message. The god king walks among his people. Except you're not walking. You might be traveling to Abydos, the cult center of Osiris, or to Heliopolis, to honor Ra, or maybe across the river to Luxor for the festival of the beautiful reunion. Wherever you're going, the roads won't be smooth, the air won't be kind, and the gods, well, they're not known for scheduling around heat waves. You're riding, sort of. You're standing upright in a bark, a giant ceremonial boat being carried on the shoulders of groaning laborers, jostling down roads that weren't meant for traffic. Or worse, you're on an actual riverboat, being poled upriver under a sun that could boil fish in the Nile. You're supposed to stand motionless, regal, like a statue of divine serenity. But inside, you're praying for a breeze, and wondering if the high priest remembered to pack the mosquito incense. You arrive in town to fanfare, drums, floral arrangements, and dancers who've been rehearsing for days. The crowd cheers. You wave carefully, so your beaded sleeve doesn't fall off again. You smile, you bless, and you're immediately escorted into a temple for an hours-long ritual that involves chanting incense smoke and possibly being locked in a shrine to commune with the god overnight. You haven't eaten since sunrise, and someone insists that you recite a hymn in archaic High Middle Egyptian that no one's actually spoken in 300 years. Your sandals are full of sand. This is fine. And while you're enduring the ceremonial part, your guards are dealing with the actual dangers. Bandits, accidents, political ambushes. Pilgrimages weren't just holy, they were vulnerable. You were far from your capital, exposed on open roads or riverways, with dozens of minor officials hoping to use your presence to settle local scores. Quirky tidbit: for some journeys, the pharaoh traveled in a portable shrine, essentially a mini chapel mounted on poles and carried by servants. Inside he would sit, surrounded by incense, sacred symbols, and near total darkness. It was called divine seclusion, but historians suspect it also doubled as a handy nap spot. That governor from the last province, he's been saving up a personal grievance for just this moment. That high priest of a minor falcon god, he's insisting on an impromptu offering. That suspiciously cheerful scribe, definitely collecting local rumors for someone in your court. There's no rest, no downtime, no silence. Even when you sleep, someone's waving sacred herbs over your head while chanting softly about rebirth and cosmic harmony. And then there's the lodging. Sure, you stay in palaces, but they're not your palace. The bed's too short. The room smells like last week's incense orgy. The bath is lukewarm, and everyone in the building is awake, all night performing rituals to make sure your dreams are pure. Historians still argue whether pilgrimages strengthened the pharaoh's rule or simply exposed royal vulnerability. Some rulers gained loyalty by showing up. Others sparked resentment with their elaborate entourages and massive spending. You were trying to impress the gods and the locals, two notoriously demanding audiences. You do it all in reverse. And when it's over, another week of travel, more ceremonies, more sand in your robes, your back hurts, your eyes burn from smoke, and your personal cupbearer has developed a concerning cough. But you can't show it. The people are watching, because the gods are watching, and symbols don't sweat. And the next town is already preparing another flower petal parade. You're not just a pilgrim, you're a symbol. They shimmer. You look out over the Nile. It's quiet, too quiet, even if they're slowly falling apart inside. The water is lower than it should be. The reed beds are too dry. The crocodiles oddly listless. You feel it before anyone says it. The flood hasn't come, or it came too soon, or too small, Or maybe it came and then vanished like a sulking god. Whatever the case, the meaning is the same. Something is wrong, and everyone is going to blame you. In ancient Egypt, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was the river, the artery of the land, the bringer of life, the holy pulse of Ma'at, made liquid. It flooded every year, right on cue, ideally, leaving behind rich black silt that made the farmland fertile. The entire economy, the food supply, and the calendar depended on it. Mainstream historical fact: the ancient Egyptians marked their year by the inundation of the Nile. The rising floodwaters were celebrated as the return of the god Hapi, who nourished Egypt. A bad flood year could mean famine, a great one meant prosperity. Pharaohs were expected to predict, encourage, and interpret the flood, often through elaborate rituals and temple sacrifices. So when the waters didn't behave, a low flood meant bad grain harvests. Bad harvests meant higher taxes meant angrier peasants, and angrier peasants meant murmurs. Soft at first, but rising with every empty stomach. No one said it outright. Not at first. The priests came forward, chanting extra long blessings. Farmers prayed harder. Temple dancers spun faster. You offered a few extra oxen, but the suspicion lingered. Had you failed the gods? Were you drifting from divine favor? It was on you. You tried to compensate. More offerings. Bigger festivals. You personally walked the temple steps barefoot, in a symbolic act of humility. The priests say the omens are mixed. They always say that when things are bad, and they don't want to get fired, or sacrificed. Quirky tidbit. In years of severe famine, there are records of temple priests being forced to cut back on daily offerings. Not because they lacked faith, but because they simply ran out of supplies. Imagine telling a crocodile god he'll have to go without scented oils this week, because the pharaoh couldn't make it rain. You send scribes to adjust grain measurements. Tell your officials to open emergency granaries. But there's only so much food, and even less patience. People begin to whisper that the gods are angry, not with Egypt, with you. Historians still debate whether the pharaoh truly believed he controlled the Nile, or whether it was all political theater. But to the people, there was no doubt. Pharaoh wasn't just a man, he was the bridge between humans and gods. If the river didn't rise, the bridge must be broken. It was lose-lose, and if it flooded too much, that wasn't good either. That meant destroyed homes, drowned crops, dead livestock. That meant chaos. Pharaoh's job was balance. Too little water, you failed. Too much, still your fault. Meanwhile, you're meeting with your astronomers and priests, trying to figure out if there's been a divine miscommunication. Did someone forget the lunar goat blessing? Did the stars warn you about this in a dream you misinterpreted? Was it that time you skipped the festival to visit your sick daughter? All you can do is perform. You'll never know. So you don't your purest linens, offer your best wine, slaughter a bull in full view of your people, and pour its blood into the river. You speak words written 1,000 years before your reign. You light incense, ring bells, anoint statues, and still, the river stays low. You do everything right, or it floods too late, or it turns brown and sluggish, and everyone avoids eye contact when they talk to you. The drought gets worse, the famine creeps in, prices go up, someone stirs rebellion in a northern province. Another province just stops sending tribute, a caravan disappears. You hold meetings all day. You sleep in shifts. You issue decrees written in optimistic language. The gods test us, but we endure. That kind of thing. They want bread, but no one's fooled. And they want someone to blame. And since you're wearing the crown, guess who's standing first in line? You keep up appearances, smile during ceremonies, walk through markets with manufactured confidence, but every puddle you step over, every wilted leaf you pass, reminds you that the Nile doesn't answer to you. Not really. And yet, you're responsible. You stand at the river's edge, alone. Your sandals sink slightly in the mud. You speak a quiet prayer, not for power, not for glory. So you pray harder. Spend more. Command a golden statue of Hapi to be built and floated down the river as a peace offering. It sinks, which feels like a message, just for rain, You're standing in the temple courtyard, sunlight bouncing off every surface like the gods installed mirrors just to watch you sweat. Before you, a line of priests presents yet another golden statue, another ivory comb, another incense holder shaped like a sacred baboon. It's a donation ceremony. Again, you've done 3 this week, and you're starting to notice a problem. You're running out of gold. Not personally. You're still draped in enough jewelry to sink a hippo. But the kingdom, the treasury, the economy that once glittered brighter than any other in the ancient world, because Egypt, for all its splendor, was too generous for its own good. It's cracking under its own generosity. Mainstream historical fact. At its peak, New Kingdom Egypt was immensely wealthy, particularly under pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramses II. Foreign powers begged for gold, and Egypt gave it freely. Lavish offerings to temples were made regularly, both to maintain divine favor and to assert power. But that wealth wasn't endlessly renewable. When the gold ran low, things began to unravel. Or, more specifically, to their earthly representatives, to the gods. And where was most of that gold going? Temples. They weren't just places of worship, they were economic juggernauts, owning land, collecting taxes, managing livestock, and employing thousands. And they didn't just receive wealth, they absorbed it. Every year, more tributes. Every season, more offerings. Every flood cycle, more ceremonies, requiring more priests, more robes, more sacred knives carved from imported wood. Everything in duplicate, sometimes triplicate, just in case. And who paid for all of this? You did. The royal coffers footed the bill. And those coffers were filled by taxing the people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants. But as temple demands grew, the burden got heavier. More gold to Amun, more silver for Hathor, more linen for Isis, and less bread in the mouths of the people. Sort of. It didn't matter if the Nile flooded perfectly. The temples took their cut first, and they always asked for more. Quirky tidbit. Amun's temple in Karnak was so wealthy and powerful that it owned its own fleet of ships, granaries, breweries, and a dedicated police force. It was like a sacred megachurch meets corporate empire. The high priest of Amun could rival the pharaoh in both power and resources, sometimes causing real political tension. You couldn't deny the gods, not publicly. If a temple said it needed a new obelisk, you built it. If a statue of Bastet needed refurbishing with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, you sent an expedition. If a single missing ritual cup threatened to unravel the cosmic order, you commissioned a dozen. And when other nations asked for gifts, you sent them too. Because generosity was a form of diplomacy, a way to remind the world who was at the top. But as more and more of your wealth flowed outward to temples, to gods, to foreign kings, the structure holding it all together grew thin. You start noticing things: troop rations, grain stores running low. A single misdelivery of incense leads to a riot in a temple town. Not because of the incense, because it's a symbol that something isn't working. Historians still argue over how much the generosity of Egypt's rulers contributed to the later decline of its empire. Some say it was a symptom, not a cause. Others believe it was a fatal flaw, a sacred obligation taken too far. Border towns under-defended, and you can't stop it. But to you it feels like a slow bleed, because every attempt to tighten spending, every reduced festival, every cancelled obelisk is seen as an insult to the gods, to tradition, to Egypt itself. So you give. You keep giving. You give until your temples shine brighter than your palace, until your treasury is mostly empty scrolls and broken promises, until your successor looks at the balance sheets and wonders how the living God on earth managed to get outspent by a cow-headed statue. And through it all, you smile. You approve the next donation. You pretend it's fine, because generosity is divine. The sun has barely risen, but already the temple bells are echoing through the capital. You're awake, dressed, anointed, and staring down yet another request from the high priest of Amun. He wants more land. Again, claims it was once sacred, that a newly discovered tablet confirms this, that the gods murmured something about it during last night's incense reading. Even when it breaks you, because the priests don't just advise you, They outrank you. You know what this is. A shakedown. A polite, perfumed, incense-wrapped shakedown. Not in theory. Officially, you're still divine, but in practice, the priesthood owns more land, more grain, more gold, and let's be honest, more loyalty from the people than your palace could ever dream of. And yet you can't stop them, because you made them. Mainstream historical fact. By the end of the New Kingdom, the priesthood of Amun controlled an estimated 1/3 of all temple wealth in Egypt. In Thebes, the high priest of Amun wielded almost royal-level authority. They managed massive estates, collected tribute, commanded armies of workers, and sometimes issued decrees with more influence than the pharaoh's own. Not just you, exactly, your predecessors, your ancestors. Pharaohs who showered the temples in wealth to gain favor, to show piety, to stabilize rule. Every gold bar donated, every land grant approved, every sacred cow gifted with a fanfare that wasn't generosity. And now the temples are cashing out. It was an investment. You try to say no, and you know they are. Or maybe it's just the priests pretending. They remind you of your coronation vow, when you promised to uphold Ma'at, to honor the gods, to provide for their earthly homes. They point to floods and say, "Do you want to be blamed for the river drying up?" They lean in and murmur that the gods are watching. Either way, your hands are tied. Quirky tidbit. The title God's Wife of Amun, often held by royal women, was created to maintain a link between the pharaoh and the increasingly independent temple establishment. But over time, even this role shifted away from palace control and became a power base of its own, fully managed by the priesthood. You try to manage the optics, and if you press too hard, your palace begins to shrink, not physically, but symbolically. Officials defer to temple decisions. Grain shipments bypass your stores and go straight to the temples. When people complain about taxes, they go to the priests, not to you. When omens are read, the gods speak through temple lips, not royal ones. You hold more festivals, commission more statues, issue declarations of divine unity, but behind the temple doors, you're losing control. The scribes report that temple guards are enforcing taxes on their own. Priests are negotiating with foreign merchants without your approval. The state within a state has become, well, they press back quietly. They don't insult you. They don't threaten. They simply stall. A ritual gets delayed. An omen becomes ambiguous. A crucial blessing is skipped. Suddenly, your next public appearance feels less sacred. The people notice, but you're not retreating. Historians still debate whether the priesthood ever directly challenged the pharaoh's power in a coup-like way. But many agree that temple influence eventually overshadowed royal authority. Some later rulers were forced to negotiate like guests in their own house. And a few simply retreated, allowing the temples to rule, while they traveled, partied or meditated on how it all went wrong. You're still trying, because the priesthood doesn't need you anymore. They have the gods, or at least the appearance of them. You issue reforms, reduce temple funding, reassign land, set new tax limits. The priests nod, bow, and say yes, and then nothing changes. Or worse, things change in your favor, for one season, and then revert. With interest, they control the rituals, the relics, the myths, and in a country where divine favor means everything, that control is absolute. You pace your hall at night, wondering how it got like this. How the son of Ra became an accessory in his own kingdom. You were supposed to channel divinity, not compete for it. But now, every act of power is filtered through temple approval. You raise your scepter, they raise their eyebrows. You fund a monument, they bless it, or don't. They own it, you command the nation. And so you keep performing, keep donating, keep smiling through gritted teeth, as the temple priests nod, accept your offerings, and remind you gently that it was your own generosity that built this cage. There's shouting in the palace courtyard, not the usual ceremonial calls or rehearsed fanfares. Actual shouting, angry, unscripted. You're sitting on your throne, carved from imported cedar and gold-leafed with the wages of 6 villagers, watching your vizier and your grain overseer argue in front of a terrified scribe. The overseer insists the people are starving. The vizier insists the temples are fully supplied, and the scribe just wants to go home. You've seen this coming. The signs were all there, and now the economy is tipping. No, scratch that. It's crashing. Mainstream historical fact. Toward the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt suffered from inflation, crop failures, political fragmentation, and overextended bureaucracy. The economy, once powered by tribute, trade, and temple tithes, began to fracture. Tomb worker strikes, once unthinkable, became documented realities. The facade of eternal prosperity cracked and fast. You'd built an empire on gold, bread, and divine PR. But gold is finite, bread needs rain, and PR only works when people still believe you control the weather. Now, the grain stores are nearly empty. Foreign trade has dried up. Nubian mines aren't producing. The temples refuse to reduce their take. The people are tired, thin, and starting to talk about omens again. Not the good kind. You call emergency councils, propose austerity. The priests blink slowly. The noble houses pretend to agree, while quietly smuggling their silver into vaults. Your advisors warn you not to look weak. Your guards report mutterings in the southern provinces. And still, the temples want their gold. Quirky tidbit. In Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb builders, workers once staged a sit-in protest because they hadn't been paid in weeks. They refused to work until grain rations resumed. The strike was peaceful, but historic. It revealed just how strained Egypt's sacred economy had become, even at its spiritual core. So you hand over more offerings and watch the royal stores empty. They insist the gods must be honored even in times of scarcity, especially in times of scarcity. After all, only devotion can bring Moat back into balance. And you, divine as you are, must lead by example. Then someone suggests raising taxes. The farmers are already breaking their tools just to avoid quotas. Merchants are hiding goods under floorboards, and every tax collector returns with fewer scrolls and more bruises. You tell your vizier, we can't push them further. Your jaw clenches. He nods. Historians still argue whether Egypt's economic collapse was gradual or punctuated by sharp disasters. Earthquakes, foreign invasions, or mass crop failures. But nearly everyone agrees that the system had become unsustainable. A divine monarchy built on limitless gifts could not survive in a world with finite patience and finite grain, and pushes anyway. You try to pivot, issue silver tokens instead of grain, encourage barter, and do nothing. Request temple cooperation in stabilizing trade. They smile politely. And then comes the worst part. You stop feeling divine. You're supposed to be Ra's chosen, Horus in the flesh. But when you step outside, no one cheers. When you process through the streets, people lower their heads, not in reverence, but exhaustion. The temples are insulated, their granaries full, their gods fed, their scribes rewriting recent harvests to make it look like Mart still smiles on them. You, however, are sweating through every council meeting, and down to your last ceremonial necklace worth pawning. You walk the temple steps alone. The incense smells like ash. The music sounds flat. It's a different name now, a quieter one. The gods don't answer when you pray. The priests offer generic encouragements. The cycle must shift. The gods test the faithful. This will pass. And for the first time in your life, no one says your name with wonder, but it doesn't. It still flows. And you begin to wonder if your rule will end, not with betrayal or war, but with silence, with the slow crushing weight of famine and apathy, with the people no longer afraid of your power, because there's none left to fear. You stare at the river again. There's a crack in the ceiling of your chamber, just silt and whispers, and the sound of 1,000 sandals walking away. But it's not bringing salvation. The empire you inherited, golden, eternal, God-blessed, is coming undone. Just a hairline, just in one of the painted stars above your bed. But you've been staring at it for weeks now, and it seems to grow a little every day. You've started to wonder if that crack is cosmic, if it means the sky above your world is starting to fall in, and everyone's pretending it isn't. Mainstream historical fact. The decline of the New Kingdom in the 11th and 10th centuries BC saw a weakening of central authority, increasing fragmentation of power, and a slide into what historians call the Third Intermediate Period. Foreign invasions, internal rebellions, and economic strain all contributed to the slow unraveling of Egypt's once mighty rule. It's daily life, but to you, it's not history. The throne is still beneath you. Provincial governors no longer return your messages. Local temples rewrite prayers to insert their own names in place of yours. One of your generals just married the daughter of a Libyan chieftain, and no one asked your permission. Small things, but together they mean something very large. But the floor's beginning to quake. At least, not to them. You issue royal decrees. Fewer are obeyed. You make new laws. Fewer are enforced. You appoint a new vizier. He defects to Thebes within a month. And while you sit in your dwindling court watching the oil lamps flicker in smaller and smaller circles of light, you begin to see what no pharaoh ever wants to see. You're not divine anymore. Quirky tidbit: one late-period pharaoh attempted to restabilize his rule by reviving Old Kingdom religious practices, including some that had been out of use for over 1,000 years. It was like trying to fix a sinking ship by putting the sails back in their original packaging. Your high priests still smile at you, but it's the smile you give to a statue in a dusty room. Respectful, reverent, carefully indifferent. The people no longer ask for your blessing. They ask for food, shelter, safe passage, things you no longer have the power to grant. The northern border is fracturing. Sea peoples are testing the coastlines. Nubia is asserting its independence. A new cult is rising in the delta, preaching a softer God, a more personal faith. The old ways are not forgotten, but they're being questioned, whispered about, doubted. Historians still argue whether the people themselves lost faith in the divine monarchy, or whether they simply adapted to survive. But in your palace, there is no doubt. When a priest drops his offering bowl and doesn't bother to ask your forgiveness, you know the change has come. You think back to your coronation, the smell of lotus blossoms, the crowd chanting, the weight of the crown, heavy, perfect. You were divine then, untouchable. The land breathed with your breath. And now, too many masons have fled the city, or died, or joined one of the regional cults promising better afterlives. You tell yourself the crack is symbolic. Maybe that makes it less embarrassing. Maybe that makes it you can't get the ceiling repaired. And still, you play the role. You try to hold on to rituals, light incense, offer prayers, anoint statues. But it all feels hollow now. The gods don't speak. Or if they do, they've turned their heads. Maybe to someone else. Maybe to a priest. Maybe to no one at all. You dress in gold. You stand during ceremonies. You tell the people that the gods are testing you, that the balance will return, that matter still flows like the Nile. But in your heart, you know, the Nile isn't flooding right. The gods aren't watching. The people are looking elsewhere, and the crack in the ceiling. It's not just a crack, it's a line dividing what you were from what you've become. The final one who still believed in the story. The last real pharaoh. But not from here. And maybe, when the next one takes the throne, they won't sit beneath painted stars. Maybe they'll rule from a temple, or a fort, or a marketplace. Not from under this collapsing sky. The ceremonies for your death have already been planned, of course. You'll be mummified with oils imported from lands that no longer acknowledge your rule. Your tomb will be filled with amulets, scrolls, and furniture crafted by artisans now too hungry to care. The Book of the Dead will be read in whispers, some by true believers, others by bored priests, just trying to keep the doors open. The sandals are ready. The procession is set. Your successor waits outside, dressed in linen that smells of cedar and new beginnings. You sit in silence, in the chamber that once held the heartbeat of an empire, and realize this is the last time anyone will call you divine without hesitation. You've spent a lifetime performing divinity, not wielding it, performing it. Every step, every decree, every golden statue offered up to the gods was part of a fragile theater you inherited and now leave behind, threadbare and gasping. Mainstream historical fact: pharaohs were buried with instructions and magic spells to guide them through the underworld. These texts, famously known as the Book of the Dead, included spells for avoiding crocodiles, persuading judgment gods, and locating your heart if it tried to escape the weighing ceremony. But by the late New Kingdom, tomb robbing was rampant, and royal burials were no longer guaranteed protection or peace. You've overseen the building of your tomb for decades. The paintings are vibrant, the walls deep, the names of gods ring through the chambers like echoes from a time when the world still made sense. And still, you know, in a generation, someone may tear it open, looking for gold, or answers, or both. Quirky tidbit: some later pharaohs began hiding their tombs in increasingly remote cliffs and valleys, even instructing workers to erase the entrances after burial. Others, unable to afford new tombs, simply moved into old ones. Nothing says divine eternal rest like recycled stonework. But they won't rule. As you take your final walk through the palace, passing columns carved with stories no one reads anymore, you see the cracks in the wall have spread, not just in your ceiling, but in the murals, the tiles, the very stones that once hummed with the prayers of 1,000 years. Your successor will have their own court, their own priests, their own dreams of unity.